Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Law&Crime Network. Yes, Law&Crime Network. It's a new name. There are new graphics. Look around down there. It looks awesome. That's because we're rebranding. No more law news. I know everyone loved that Z. It was one of the most popular things ever. That's a joke. We decided it was time for a rebrand, and we're going to have a big announcement coming later today about how big this rebrand actually is. But for now, just enjoy what we've got here. We're continuing to cover the Adam Matos trial, but we do have a new look and a new name, and we'll have more information on it later today. In the meantime, we want to get back to coverage of the Adam Matos trial. We're expecting testimony to begin at about 9:30 a.m. Eastern time today. The prosecution case is continuing here. After all, the defense did not even present an opening statement, so it is prosecution, prosecution, prosecution in a seemingly strong case. We were actually talking about this in studio before. I'm joined by two of our Law News regulars, Stephanie Willis and Jesse Weber. Guys, thanks for coming in. Good to see you guys.
Good seeing you.
On this first new day, the new dawn of Law&Crime.
Looks great.
It's very exciting.
So exciting.
More to come. But let's talk about what we're expecting today. Jesse, we saw, as you pointed out, at the end of the day on Friday, testimony from various people talking about items that Adam Matos was selling in the house. Why is that so important?
Well, first, let me just say, so Friday was a break. We saw the end of testimony Thursday.
Sorry, Thursday.
No worries.
Yeah.
But Friday, we're recapping because there was so much to catch up on. So we saw the testimony from Craigslist customers because we know that Adam Matos began selling the personal items of the Browns. He started selling the TVs, the dogs, the cell phone, the laptop, audio gear. Started selling everything. Now, why would somebody who seemingly had nothing to do with this crime begin to sell all of the items of the deceased family members? It didn't quite make sense.
And at bargain basement prices, right? I mean, you're selling like
Exactly.
purebred dogs for nothing on Craigslist.
Correct. He's selling purebred dogs for, I believe it was approximately like $50. That's something that's really unheard of. Shows that he was really in a rush to try to get rid of all of the items that were in the home. So why would someone who had nothing to do with these murders want to sell these personal items so quickly?
Yeah, and look, he doesn't, as I was researching, I've been following the case on and off as we've been covering it, but sort of took a deep dive in preparation for today, and I kept saying to myself, but what's the defense? What's the defense? So I know we haven't seen an opening statement yet, but what might they argue? And I came up with two, I guess there are two possible other suspects here, right? You've got the idea that this is a quadruple murder. Mm-hmm. You've got Megan Brown, you've got her parents, and you've got this guy who she was either involved with or a friend of hers, whatever the case may be, Nick Leonard. And Leonard, the day before, had maybe called in complaining about an ex-girlfriend to Verizon. And then you also had the fact that Megan Brown herself had called in about a female stalker shortly before the murders happened. You don't usually get that as a defense, meaning two identifiable possible theories. I mean, that seems to me that if, while saying the defense doesn't seem to have much of an argument here, it's also pretty rare to have two identifiable things where you can say, hey, wait a sec, what about these guys?
Absolutely, I completely agree with you. And it's the fact that they, both of the descriptions that were made were of a female. So the defense can tie into the case that it's possible that Nick Leonard's previous love interest is the individual who may or may not have done this crime.
Of course, then you'd have to ignore the fact that the day she dies, he is threatening to kill her,
Right.
And there's a 911 tape of it, etc. I mean,
Right.
It does require you ignoring quite a bit of evidence. It's
Absolutely.
out there.
See, my issue is, and Dan, you made a great point. What is the defense going to do? Because I imagine that they were going to bring this up in their opening argument, and they didn't. What was interesting was we heard that name, one of the names that you mentioned, Michelle Stinson. We tried to hear that brought up by the defense when they were cross-examining Nicholas Leonard's father, and there was an objection, a rightful objection. So they weren't able to bring it in then. I imagine they're going to go this route because otherwise, how do you explain away this behavior from Adam Matos? They need another suspect.
Yeah, and as we're waiting, again, we're expecting testimony to begin in about 25 minutes or so from now. We're going to play some of the key testimony that we heard from already in this case. But one of the questions is the defense going to present an opening statement at all? And we were talking about the fact that they could present it at the end of the prosecution's case, right?
Right. So they could present an opening statement at the prosecution's case if they want to proceed forward with putting a defense. Now, if I'm the defense attorney in this case, I have to put on a defense because the prosecution's case at this point has been so strong. So we'll see what happens. What do you think, Jesse?
I think that they should, because here's the thing. They said if we decide to put on our case, like Stephanie said. The problem is I imagine then that they were going to keep on attacking the prosecution's case, all of their witnesses, all of the methods that were used by investigators. I haven't really seen that. I haven't seen such a strong cross-examination. So they need to do something, and I think they need to do something by starting with some sort of opening argument to their case.
Yeah. And then, of course, you got the fact that he's just so good looking. I mean,
with or without beard?
Yeah.
Now remember that one of the prospective jurors in this case said she didn't think she could be objective and fair because he's so handsome.
Yeah.
But all jokes aside, everything ends up mattering in a case like this, right? I mean, if you've got a client, you think about how to dress them in court. You think about how you want the jury to perceive them, et cetera. This goes to, we have issues with racial bias in this country every day.
Right.
How someone looks does end up mattering in prospective jurors saying, could he have done this? Really?
He kind of looks like the actor that would play him.
Yeah, exactly.
Not actually the guy that did it.
Exactly.
But it matters.
Yeah.
Appearance matters. There's a reason we dress our clients up in certain ways before they're presented, and especially if in the chance he does decide to take the stand, they got to make sure he's presentable.
Hey, let's do this, because we were debating this before. I want to come back and talk about whether he'll take the stand, because that's a critical question. But I want to play a little bit of the sound from the trial. Again, we're expecting testimony to begin about 9:30. So Linda Thomas testified last week. Very emotional testimony. She is Megan's grandmother, I guess, and the stepmother of Margaret Brown. Again, because Margaret and her husband killed, Megan killed 4 people total. So let's listen to Linda Thomas, who is Margaret Brown's stepmother's testimony from last week.
How did you know Margaret Brown? You need a moment?
You may.
I'm sorry. I'll do the best I can. I knew this would be hard. I'm sorry. She's my stepdaughter. And my best friend. And I've known her since before we married.
Since before you and Jim Thomas married?
Correct.
Okay. Take a deep breath for me. Now, Margaret Brown, did she go by Maggie?
To some people, to us, we just called her Mag.
Okay. She have a lot of siblings?
Yes, she has 3 brothers and 3 sisters.
And these are your stepchildren also?
They are also, yes.
And Margaret's biological mother, she's still alive?
Yes, she is.
And where do they all live?
Her siblings and her mother all live in New Jersey.
Is that the general area of the world that Maggie comes from?
Yes.
And did you have a good relationship with Margaret?
I had a wonderful relationship. A very loving person and very funny.
How old was she in August of 2014?
52.
What'd she do for work?
At the time that she was murdered?
Well, in general, in the years leading up to, let's say, the year leading up to July of 2014.
Okay, she bred horses at times. She was breeding dogs right until the time that we lost her. And she also worked at Wawa as a cashier.
Okay. Now, in August, let's strike that. In terms of the raising dogs, has she been doing that for a while?
Yes, since the mid-1990s.
And she was still doing that in 2014, in August of 2014.
That's correct.
Was she married?
Yes, she was married to Gregory Brown.
And do you know how long she and Gregory Brown have been together?
Longer than my husband and I. I don't know the exact date that they first became a couple, or their exact date of their marriage, but I know that they were together. I met them together the first time I met Mag.
So since you've been a part of the family, Greg Brown and Margaret Brown were together.
Yes.
And do you know how old Greg Brown was in August 2014?
Yes, he was also 52.
And did you know him very well?
Yes.
You get along well with him?
Oh, yes. He was very good at including us in his life.
And what did he do for work?
He was an electrician.
Now, in August of 2014, what, was he working?
No, he was recovering from some back surgeries.
Okay.
Or surgery, I'm sorry.
Now, did Margaret and Greg have any children?
Yes, they did.
How many children?
They had 2 children together. Their son Gregory, Aaron, we call him Aaron, and then their daughter Megan. And then Mag had a son from a previous relationship, but he was raised and grew up in the same household with Greg and Mag.
And that's Michael Monahan?
Michael Monahan.
Now, Gregory, Aaron Brown, and Michael Monahan, where did they live, or where do they still live?
In New Jersey.
And
At this time, although Aaron and Megan and Michael also all lived at the farm.
okay. Now, Megan Brown, in August of 2014, how old was she?
27.
Now, did Megan have any children?
Yes, she had 1 son.
And do you know his name, or what his legal name was back in August of 2014?
Yeah, well, we know him as Tristan, but it was Ishmael Tristan Santisteban, I believe is the correct pronunciation.
And do you know how old was he in August of 2014?
4.
Do you know who Tristan's father is?
Yes, the defendant, Adam Matos.
In this summer of 2014, August of 2014, did Tristan have any challenges communicating?
Yes, he did.
And based on your observation, what was the nature of that?
He was very autistic and was not verbalizing very much in understandable language, except to his mother. She knew what he wanted.
Now, in the years leading up to August of 2014, where were Greg and Margaret Brown living?
Before they moved to Florida, they were living in central Pennsylvania in Lehigh County in a town called New Tripoli.
And they had a farm there?
Yes, they did.
When did they move to Pasco County, Florida?
They actually physically left the farm on or about June 30th, and then they arrived in Hudson, this is of 2014, and then they arrived in Hudson, I think it was July 2nd.
So it starts out as some very emotional testimony, but in truth, she's also offering some important substantive points here for the prosecution. Yes, seeing how emotional she gets. Yes, seeing how much she misses those who were killed is obviously incredibly important with a jury. But she's also talking about some important points about family dynamics here, which do lay the groundwork for much of what we see in this case. And so, Jesse, the issue of identifying Adam Matos as the father was not that clear, right? I mean, there was a whole history behind this.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, Megan Brown was involved with another man, and the question became, did that young Tristan, who was 4 years old at the time of this incident, was the father Adam Matos, or was it this other individual? And they had to do a DNA test to determine that Adam Matos was the actual biological father of Tristan.
Because she was actually dating somebody else at the time, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
Exactly, which complicates matters even further. And what's interesting also, Dan, is that last week some of the family members were questioned about whether they knew that Adam Matos was in fact the biological father here, including Jim Thomas, who was the grandfather of Megan. And he was questioned, did you know? Did you understand the relationship? Trying to pinpoint that a little bit more about what their understanding was of the Adam Matos-Megan Brown relationship.
You are watching the newly rebranded Law and Crime Network. For those of you who regularly watch this network, you're going to say, things look a little different. And the answer is yes, they do. We hope you think that they look a little better. We have changed the name of the network. We have changed the name of our website. And we are going to have a bigger announcement about this later today. But, look around. You'll see all the same faces, etc., but hopefully framed in a way that makes them look that much better. I know it's hard to believe they could look any better than they do. Talking about the Adam Matos trial, we're expecting testimony to begin at about 9:30-ish today. As courtroom watchers know, it's never certain exactly what time a trial starts. We're given a basic guideline. But one of the key questions in this case is whether Adam Matos might testify, right? Because we're in the prosecution's case. We were talking earlier about whether the opening statement will be made. Remember, the defense didn't even give an opening statement in this case. And so will the defense present an opening statement? That's an interesting question, but it's a lot less interesting than the question of whether Adam Matos would take the stand. I was saying, no way, no chance, no how, and yet you guys, I think it was you, Jesse, was saying that you thought there was a shot.
I think there's a very strong chance that he's going to take the stand. I think when you've put on a case where I expected the defense to really hit on every one of the prosecution's witnesses and they haven't done that, you need to have that witness, you need to have your defendant come on, explain his behavior if he can.
Well, that's the point. How does he explain the 911 call?
It's going to be
that
super
morning?
entertaining.
Yeah,
Don't you agree?
when he was
totally
threatening
agree.
to kill her that morning, that she ends up dying.
That'll be a very difficult hurdle to overcome, but the former prosecutor in me is salivating at the fact that we would potentially have this defendant come on the stand and testify to provide the story or his version of the facts. And there is also the fact that I believe that he had a previous prior assault. So you not only have that prior assault, but you also have these 911 tapes, which actually began this whole trial. This is how this whole trial started. So it should be pretty interesting.
So his defense becomes what? I am just unlucky, right? It just happened that the same day and this is, look, we see this a lot. I'm mocking it, but the truth is we do see this in a lot of cases, which is the defendant basically says, yes, I was incredibly unlucky. Yes, I did something horrible that makes it look like I'd be the guy. But somebody else came in as it happened the same day or the day after and did something even worse.
Now, he could try to do that, but I think another interesting theory is one that was presented by our very own Aaron Keller, who said that this might have been a powder keg waiting to blow, that emotions were running so high in this family that we don't know who was the aggressor when this incident took place, and they might be taking the stance that if Adam Matos was somehow defending himself, they might reduce the degree of murder here. And I thought that's an interesting point that they might want to explore.
Against all four?
Exactly. And by the way,
it's one person, I get it, but
and they were killed in different ways. So, and it doesn't quite make sense. But I am curious to see if they go that route. Look, they're running out of options here.
Right, right. Megan comes after him, then Megan's mother comes after him, and one after the other, he's like, sort of Batman in there, kind of like knocking them all out and defending himself. I don't know. It just, it's a tough. Look, I get it. Look, this is a tough defense, and for us to try to be fair, we're trying to figure out what possible arguments could Adam Matos make in his defense.
Well, I think that is a very interesting point, this whole self-defense kind of a story that the defense could possibly bring up during their case. But I think that it's something that's highly unlikely, especially due to the fact that we have testimony that Megan was actually informed her friends that she was afraid that Adam was going to kill her. So I think that would be a very tough hurdle. This self-defense story would be very tough for the defense to bring forward.
We're seeing heartbreaking photos there on the screen of Megan with her little baby boy. And what do we know about the relationship that Adam Matos had with the boy?
From all accounts, it seems like it was a loving relationship. I'll tell you this much, from the family members who have testified, they haven't said really anything negative. I mean, yes, he had to discipline him in certain ways, but he was very loving towards him. And as difficult it is to say, Dan, the fact of the matter is this little boy survived this incident. And I think the value in him being his own son might have something to do with it.
Was there any aspect of the motive associated with the son? Meaning, do they think that, obviously she was there with another man, this guy, Nick Leonard, which could have been the motive, but is there any discussion about a possible motive surrounding custody or something regarding the son that we know of?
That's an interesting point, but none that I've heard of.
So the interesting thing about this case is we don't know precisely what the motive is. I think there might have been discussions in the leading up to this trial that there was a conflict between the Brown family and Matos about his level of support, the way he child rearing, things like that, that might have led into what happened. Ultimately, we don't know what happened in that house, but I do believe that Tristan, who is autistic, he was 4 years old, there was a difficulty there in raising him, and I think that might have contributed to some of this, but we're not entirely clear based upon how the prosecution has framed this case so far about Tristan's involvement.
I think that it's also important to point out the fact that even when Megan originally stated that he was threatening her, once Tristan came out, he immediately exited the home. So that goes to show that he did not want his son to see whatever was going on between him and Megan. And the fact that when they found Tristan with him in the hotel, Tristan was in good spirits. So it shows that they possibly did have a great relationship.
But wasn't he like living in the house with Tristan afterwards where the bodies are decomposing? I mean,
so let's picture this for a second, okay? We know there's the decomposed bodies. We know there's blood all over the house. There's a terrible odor. The pizza delivery guys who've testified, at least one of them has said, I saw him. I saw this young boy in the house when I delivered the pizza. So you can only imagine this nightmare, this house that this young 4-year-old boy was living in for days.
Yeah. I can tell you, as the dad of a 5-year-old, you start thinking about a kid like that. I think any parent can relate to how horrible it is. Again, the way that kids are impacted in these cases is always the part that really pulls at your heartstrings. Let's, as we prepare to go back live into the courtroom, and again, live coverage beginning in about 10 minutes or so in the Adam Matos trial. We want to show you some of the testimony from a neighbor, and there are two neighbors who are critical here. One of them has not testified yet, but one of them did testify, Justin Okins, and exactly what he saw around the time becomes important. Let's listen.
Thank you. Do you recall about what time you got back to your residence?
Around 10:45, 11 o'clock.
Arrogant, you gotta keep your voice up, it's like you not hear half.
10:45, 11 o'clock. I'm
Great,
sorry.
thank you, that's all right, I know, there's too many rules around here.
And when you got home, who were you with?
At the time, she was my girlfriend, Kristen Anderson.
And is she still your girlfriend?
She's actually my fiance now, but.
Congratulations. So once y'all got home, what did y'all decide to do?
We had just come back from a couple-hour drive, so our legs were kind of stiff, and our dogs were waiting for us there. So we decided that once we got back, we would want to take a walk to stretch our legs out a bit and to, get out with the dogs and whatnot. So we decided to walk down New York Avenue and then took a right on Old Dixie and started to proceed down Old Dixie.
Okay, so do you remember about what time you went on the walk?
We started around like 11:15, 11:20 when we left my mom's house.
Okay, and would you mind kind of just showing the jury the path that you took on this map?
So basically we left from my mom's house, went down here, took a right and followed this road basically down to where the blue star is.
Now, that blue star that is on the map, did you place that star there?
Yes, sir.
And the star, why did you put it in that particular location?
I heard a noise that had grabbed my attention. Sounded like a firearm discharging.
And that's as you were walking the dogs that night?
Yes, sir.
And roughly what time was it when you heard that noise?
Like 11:45 to 12 o'clock.
And did it sound like it was a single gunshot or multiple gunshots?
At the time, it was a single shot. At that spot right there was the first time I heard the pop noise. And then we continued walking because it's not really out of the ordinary to hear a sound like that around that area. But then I heard a few more after that, a little, short time afterward, and that's when I decided, after the fourth time I had heard it, I decided that it was time for me and my pregnant girlfriend to turn around and head home.
And what can you tell us about the spacing and the timing between these shots?
From the first sound that I heard, which would be the blue star right here, it was probably approximately somewhere in the range of a minute to 2 minutes. And then I heard two more, which were spaced out maybe 10, 15 seconds. And then a fourth one, probably 20 to 30 seconds after the third sound.
And
Shot.
about how far did you walk before you finally decided to turn around?
It was like right around in this area right here.
Now, the noises that you heard you've described as gunfire. Are you familiar with guns?
Yes, sir.
Have you fired guns throughout your life?
Yes, sir.
Were you a hunter when you were younger?
I was a hunter. Yes, sir.
Are you still a hunter?
I still hunt every year.
And were you ever in the Army?
Yes, sir.
And were you a weapons technician in the Army?
Yes, sir.
So have you had a lot of experience with multiple different types of firearms throughout your life?
Pretty wide range.
Handguns and long rifles or shotguns?
Yes.
And the particular gunshot that you heard, what did it sound like to you?
To me, it sounded like a low caliber handgun.
Low caliber meaning a small caliber
Yeah,
handgun?
between 22 to maybe like a 9mm, somewhere in that range.
Now, you said you got to this point and decided to turn around and you went back to your residence.
Yes, sir.
Did you call 911 at that point?
No, because like I said, that's not really out of the ordinary. I mean, every month, 2 or 3 times a month, right in this area right here, there's a big retention pond, and a guy flies a helicopter over there all the time. You hear gunshots, people out there testing out a firearm they just bought. It is,
Somewhat rural area.
it is a somewhat rural area, especially with all the land out here too,
And I know it's somewhat difficult to isolate the sound of gunfire, but did you get a general idea of where the noise was coming from?
To me, it sounded like 11 o'clock.
And when you say 11 o'clock, will you tell the jury what you mean by that?
My 12 o'clock would be directly in front of me, 11 o'clock would be just to the left of me slightly. So it sounded, from right there, it sounded like it was around in this area right here.
And at any point, did you notify law enforcement about what you heard?
After, I believe it was the next day or the day after, I believe it was the next day though, we had heard on...
Could it have been September 5th?
Possibly, it's
Okay.
been a little while.
3 years. It's been a while.
Yeah. Yeah, at that point, once we had heard that something had happened there, I just wanted to go down and just kind of let hey, I was walking my dogs, that night, and I wanted you guys to know that I did hear what sounded to me to be a low caliber discharge of a firearm.
Thank you. May I have just one moment, Judge?
So those were the gunshots that were heard. At least it seems those were the gunshots that were heard. And before we talk about what the cause of death actually was, let's take a look at the courtroom as we're waiting for the testimony to begin. This is a live picture that you're going to see here of the courthouse. Adam Matos is now in the courtroom, and they are preparing for testimony to resume. They took Friday off in this case and are now back this Monday morning for continuing testimony. Let's talk about the possible, what we know to be the cause of death. We were talking in the break as we were listening to them talk about the gunshots. Jesse, you were laying out the ways that all 4 of the victims died, and not all of them from gunshots.
No, they all died in different ways. We know that Megan Brown and Gregory Brown suffered gunshot wounds. Megan Brown, in fact, suffered a gunshot wound through her eye. Gregory Brown got shot in the back and the front. We know that Nicholas Leonard suffered blunt force trauma with something that was consistent with a hammer, even hit over 21 times. They weren't even sure if those hits were happened after he died. And then we know that Margaret Brown suffered also blunt force trauma, but also asphyxiation with a plastic bag. Really brutal nature, but it was interesting the fact that we had 2 victims that were killed in different ways from the other 2 victims, which again plays into question about the timing of how all these attacks took place.
Yeah, and Stephanie, and then the bodies are found, like a mile away,
A mile away,
right?
correct. So the bodies were found stacked one on top of each other a mile away north from the home. And so I think that it was pretty easy for the sheriffs to find, especially after being able to find the blood traces in the home and in the garage. So I think that everything that was found in this case, particularly with the way that the injuries that the victims sustained, everything is very gruesome and gory. And I think that the defense did a good job in trying to edit or remove some of the pictures that the jury would be seeing because of how prejudicial it would have been, because of how gruesome the murders actually were.
Did the court agree to remove certain pictures? Or?
Some of the pictures were edited or removed because the court felt that it would have been too prejudicial for the members of the jury to see.
What was interesting at the beginning, at the start of this trial, I know there was at least one photo that the judge said, I've seen crime photos before. I'm not giving a special instruction to this. The jury can see it. She didn't have a problem with it. She says, it's a crime scene. You don't see the graphic nature of it. That was one photo. But it kind of gave you a sense of what this judge is about. She's no nonsense. She's a great judge in this case.
And any specific, Jesse, do you know the specifics on which the pictures were?
I'm not 100% sure in terms of what was seen by the jury and what wasn't. I think it's always, as Stephanie was saying, it's an interesting balancing game because
most of the time they just let them see them. And most of the time they say, look, this is what happened. This is, you know, life is ugly and death is ugly. And that's part of the trial.
Well, we also have to remember that I believe it was Nicholas's head was shattered in so much that they couldn't even reassemble the skull. So that's something to consider.
Yeah, no, it's true. Adam Matos sitting in the courtroom preparing for the day's testimony. This again a live picture of the courtroom as we're waiting for testimony to begin in this case. I'm trying to decide. I think we will. Let's show another piece of sound from the case. But as soon as testimony begins, we're going to break out of it and go back to live coverage. But we were talking about the neighbors. We were talking about hearing gunshots, and as you can imagine, hearing gunshots in a neighborhood when you've got neighbors is something that people are going to hear. And this is one of the other neighbors talking about what he heard that night.
Would you mind stepping down and coming to this map? And again, for the record, this map is 257 for ID. Would you kind of point out the general vicinity of where her residence is, where y'all were staying that night? And what is your relationship?
Ms. Anderson, this court reporter right here has to take down what you say. You're fine where you are, you just got to keep your voice up. You're not just talking to him, you're talking to the whole room.
Yeah, it's in like that vicinity right there.
And that residence is at Justin Oakens' mother's residence?
Yes.
And what is your relationship with Justin Oakens?
He's my fiance.
Okay. And in
Fiance.
Thank you.
Let's move it down this way so you're a little closer to the microphone. Can you all still see down there? Are we blocking your view? Okay. The microphone's right here, so if you kind of it should pick you up. Justin Oakens is your fiance?
Yes.
And on this particular evening, when y'all got to that residence, did y'all decide to go for a walk?
Yes, we took the dogs out.
And do you remember approximately what time that was?
It was between 10 and midnight.
And what path did you take? Would you mind showing us on the map?
We walked down New York and then headed down towards Old Dixie and then around the bend.
Now, there's a blue star on that map.
Yes.
Is there anything significant about the placement of that star?
That's around when we first started hearing the gunshots.
And what can you tell us about the gunshots? Roughly how many did you hear?
Between 3 to 5.
And what do you recall about the spacing of the gunshots?
I recall that there was one and then there were a couple more.
Do you recall how long the break was between one and then the couple more that you mentioned?
It was pretty brief.
Okay. And the couple more that you heard, do you recall what the spacing between those was?
It was fairly rapid.
Okay. Now, do you remember if Justin said anything at that point?
I know after the first one, he was kind of like, "Do you hear that?" And I was like, "Nah." I was like, "I heard something." And he said it was a gunshot. And I was like, "Oh, yes, what?" Like, I realized that it actually was one. And then we heard the couple more. And it reaffirmed. I was like, "Oh, yeah, those were gunshots."
Now, are you familiar with guns?
Yes.
Have you been around guns most of your life?
Yes.
Where did you grow up?
Odessa.
Okay. And you've heard gunfire numerous times?
Yes.
And it sounded like gunfire to you?
Yes.
Do you have enough familiarity with firearms to give any description of what type of caliber firearm it sounded like?
That I don't.
Okay. So what did you do after you heard the noises? How far down the road did you continue?
We continued on down to about that drive there, and then we turned around and went on back.
Turned around and went home.
Yes.
We are going to cut into this clip because they are back live in the courtroom in the Adam Matos trial. As we're watching the judge now on the bench, we're seeing Adam Matos at the defense table. And guys, what are we expecting to hear today in terms of testimony?
Well, I would imagine that either today, or I think today, they're going to bring in Ryan McCann, the neighbor of the Browns.
And he's not just someone who just heard gunshots.
No, he
right.
was intimately involved in being with Adam Matos during this time. He even went out with him during this time, went out to a bar. So I can't wait to hear that
Right.
testimony.
I mean, he went out to a bar with him after the murders, and then there was an incident that occurs at the
Mm-hmm,
bar, and so he really goes to almost Adam Matos's mindset and his psychological state after the killings. They are. I'm just seeing if we should be going back into the courtroom. You know what? All right. So he becomes one of probably the top 2 or 3 witnesses in the context of this case, because not only did he see Adam Matos shortly after it happened, right? He also then ends up hanging out with him.
Yeah, and I think it's crazy because especially after the murders actually occurred, he goes out with Ryan, and then he gets into a little bit of an incident with an older woman, and he's drunk. I mean, so if I were the prosecutor in this case, I would be bringing out those facts.
Let's go back live into the courtroom.
Depending on how long this defense case takes. I'm not saying we will do them because I don't want to do them late in the day. Jury instructions on this type of case take a long time.
Yep.
But if, let's say, they don't put on very many people and we're talking about 11 o'clock, I'll probably go into those arguments. Okay?
So, as they're dealing with what the judge is calling an unrelated matter, it's never totally unrelated, but it becomes a somewhat peripheral matter, is my guess. Just talking about the schedule for this case, and apparently the prosecution is scheduled to wrap up its case tomorrow. And that would mean that's the time when the defense is going to decide, do we present an opening statement? Do we present a case? And I just have to believe that this is going to be one of those cases where they simply say that they haven't proved it beyond a reasonable doubt, and they pray. But that's it.
Well,
I don't know what else.
Well, Stephanie, correct me if I'm wrong. If here's how it would work, wouldn't they at least try to go for a motion to dismiss? That's obviously not going to work here.
Yep.
And I think that they have to, if they were going to attack every piece of evidence brought in by the prosecution, their witnesses, any of the evidence that was brought in, I would have said we attacked it very thoroughly. They don't have a case. They have nothing right now. They have to bring in some sort of case. Something for the jury to grasp onto. Because right now, based upon the prosecution's theory and everything they brought in, it's a slam dunk.
Yeah, I have to agree with Jesse on this.
So why does this case go to trial? Why does a case like this, I mean, there was no deal, probably, right? No deal offered.
And he's saying he didn't do it.
Right, and he's saying he didn't do it. It would be amazing if he would take the stand. It's just not going to happen, though.
Now, if that becomes the case, They have to prep this guy like he's never been prepped for anything before in his life.
Except if he's innocent, then he doesn't have to be prepped. He'll be able to just speak the truth, and the truth will set him free.
But the prosecution can bring in they can bring in other evidence to attack his credibility. They can bring other evidence of bad things he's done in the past.
And they don't even need the past. They got the 911 tape from that morning. I mean, they have the victim screaming, "He's going to kill me!"
Right.
From the morning she gets killed. That's very, very hard to overcome.
No, I have to agree with you. It's extremely hard to overcome. You not only have that, you have corroborating testimony from her friend Tanya Carlson, I believe, who testified that she was getting text messages from her from him the night before. So you have all of this evidence that's pointing to him. So he's going to have to do something.
We had a defense attorney on here, Russell Novak, and I said to him, okay, if you were defending this guy, how would you do it? He goes, is there any DNA linking him to any of the murder weapons? No. Is there any DNA linking him to any of the bodies? No. So you don't know exactly if he killed them. You're just prosecuting him on everything that he did afterward. I was like, you're a good defense attorney.
Right.
I said, will that be enough for a jury to buy? Maybe.
Right. You played the CSI card.
Yeah.
You play the card that says unless you have every piece of physical evidence linking him, even though there does seem to be an enormous amount of evidence against him, but unless you have every DNA, it's funny, in a lot of the trials that I cover, they find a fingerprint, right, that doesn't match the defendant. And they say, aha, so somebody else was, yes, other people were in the house at other times. It is true. Other people's fingerprints, they had guests, they had gardeners, they had the mailman, they had, yes. But those defenses are really tough. To basically say, well, why didn't they investigate this fingerprint? Why? Because they got their guy.
Yeah.
They've got all the other evidence. I mean, all the other evidence that implicates him. I mean, police are not expected to spend days and days and days investigating other possible leads when they have an enormous amount of evidence already against a particular person.
Well, I think in that case, then, as a defense attorney, then you can counteract
You do.
that.
No, this is what we hear in every case.
Yeah.
Every case.
Why didn't the police do more?
Why didn't they do more? They focused on my client. Why'd they focus on your client? Because there was a lot of evidence against him.
He was living in
right.
the
I mean,
house,
it's like
and he escaped the area.
I mean, I know. They should have done more to look at other, the OJ / Scott Peterson, whatever the case may be. Why didn't they? Anyway, I'm going to stop ranting.
No, not at all.
Let's go back to the courtroom. It looks like they finally resolved that unrelated matter. Let's go back.